Welcome to our presentation created by Mustafa Abdurazak, which is me, and Imran Akbar, my colleague. Lecture 6, it is about Lecture 6, Bitcoin and anonymity. Lecture 6.1, anonymity basics. Some people say Bitcoin provides anonymity. The quote is Bitcoin is a secure and anonymous digital currency from WikiLeaks donation page. Other people say it doesn't. The quote is Bitcoin won't hide you from the NSA prying eyes. The NSA are the National Security Agency. From Wired UK. What do we mean by anonymity? Anonymous means without a name. When we try to apply this definition to Bitcoin, there are two possible interpretations: interacting without using your real name. Bitcoin addresses are public key hashes rather than real identities. Computer scientists call this pseudonymity. Anonymity on computer science. Anonymity equals pseudonymity plus unlinkability. Different interactions of the same user with the system should not be linkable to each other. What is pseudonymity? Bitcoin addresses are hashes of public keys. You do not need to use your real name in order to interact with the system, but you do use your public key hash as your identity. Bitcoin is anonymous as you do not use your real name. The address that you use is a pseudo identity. In the language of computer science, the use of an identity that is not your real name is called pseudonymity. Bitcoin is pseudonymous, but pseudonymity is not enough if your goal is to achieve privacy. The blockchain is public and anyone can look up all Bitcoin transactions that involve a given address. If anyone is ever able to link your Bitcoin address to your real identity, then all of your transactions from the present, past, and future will have been linked back to your identity. Pseudonymity versus anonymity. The examples from the online forums. Reddit pick a long-term pseudonym versus 4chan make posts with no attribution at all. The difference between anonymity and pseudonymity is something that you might be familiar with from a variety of other contexts. On a forum like Reddit, you pick a long-term pseudonym and interact over a period of time with that pseudonym. You can create multiple pseudonyms or even a new one for every comment, but that would be annoying, so most people don't do it. So interacting on Reddit is usually pseudonymous, but not quite anonymous. 4chan, by contrast, is the online forum which users generally post anonymously with no attribution at all. Why is unlinkability needed? A lot of Bitcoin services require real identities. Link profile can be de-anonymized by a variety of side channels. What does unlinkability mean? In computer science, anonymity refers to pseudonymity together with unlinkability. So basically, this equation over here. Unlinkability is a property that's defined with respect to the capabilities of a specific adversary. Unlinkability means that if a user interacts with the system repeatedly, these different transactions should not be able to be tied to each other from the point of view of the adversary in consideration. Defining unlinkability in Bitcoin. The first two properties are easy to understand, but the third one is a bit tricky. These are the 3 points. It should be hard to link together different addresses of the same user. Second one is it should be hard to link together different transactions made by the same user. And the last one is it should be hard to link the sender of a payment to its recipient. Okay. If you interpret a payment as a Bitcoin transaction, then the third property is clearly false. Every transaction has inputs and outputs, and these inputs and outputs are inevitably going to be in the blockchain and publicly linked together. However, what we mean by a payment is not a single Bitcoin transaction, but rather anything that has the effect of transferring Bitcoins from the sender to the recipient. It might involve a series of transactions. What we want to ensure is that it's not likely to link the sender and the ultimate recipient of the payment by looking at the blockchain. Quantified anonymity. Complete unlinkability amongst all transactions addresses is difficult. Anonymity set. What is an anonymity set? The third property seems hard to achieve. Say you pay for a product that costs a certain number of bitcoins and you send that payment through a route of transactions. Somebody looking at the blockchain will still be able to infer something from the fact that a certain number of bitcoins left one address and roughly the same number of bitcoins minus the transaction fees, which might have ended up at some other address. Despite the route, the initial sending and the ultimate receiving happen roughly in the same time period because the merchant want to receive payment without too much of a delay. To calculate anonymity set, define an adversary model, reason carefully about what the adversary knows, does not know, and cannot know. What about money laundering? It's a massive worry within the crypto community. There is a legitimate concern that truly anonymous cryptocurrencies can be used for money laundering or other illegal activities, also on the black market. The good news is that while cryptocurrency transactions themselves may be pseudonymous or anonymous, the interference between digital cash and fiat currencies is not. Can we only keep the good uses? Uses uses that are very differently morally are pretty much the same technologically. Speaking about more about the good things, our view is that the potential good that's enabled by having anonymous cryptocurrencies warrant their existence, and that we should separate the technical anonymity properties of the system from the legal principles we apply when it comes to using the currency. It's not a complete satisfactory solution, but it's perhaps the best way to achieve a favorable trade-off. Tor. Tor is an anonymous connection network. Sender and receiver of message unlinkable is unlinkable. It is used by these five people: law enforcement, also used in malware, normal people, journalists, and child pornographers. This is the Tor example topology. Here's the Tor client, the entry guard, the middle relay, the network in the middle covered with clouds, the exit relay, and the destination. All the green lines are encrypted, and all the red lines are not encrypted by Tor. Tor is used by normal people over here who want to protect themselves from being tracked online. It's used by journalist activists to speak freely online without fear of repercussion from oppressive regimes. It is also used by law enforcement agents who want to monitor suspects online without revealing their IP address, as ranges or blocks of IP addresses assigned to different organizations, including law enforcement agencies, tend to be well known. So they do this so they can stay anonymous. Tool has many applications that we might morally approve of. However, it also has clearly bad uses. It's used by operators of botnets to issue commands and prevent double spending. So basically malware. To the infected machines under their control. And it's used to distribute child pornography. So these are the bad things about using Tor that can happen. Anonymous eCash, created by David Chum in 1982, a blind signature. It is a two-party protocol to create digital signature without the signer knowing the input. So, anonymity versus decentralization. The design function of anonymization and decentralization are often in conflict with each other. The Chum's eCash has achieved perfect anonymity in a sense, but through a blind signature protocol that we spoke about earlier here, the blind signature. Through a blind signature protocol. And with the central authority. The central authority is the bank. However, such protocols are very difficult to decentralize. If we try to decentralize, then we must keep some sort of mechanism to trace transactions and prevent double spending. This public traceability of transactions is a threat to anonymity. Also, in the simpler terms, interactive protocols with bank are difficult to decentralize. Decentralization is often achieved by public traceability to enforce security. 6.2. How to de-anonymize Bitcoin. The importance to create a new address. This is a snippet from WikiLeaks donation page on the Bitcoin transaction. You can see all of this and the QR code on the side and the refresh button. So if you click the refresh button, it will replace the donation address with an entirely new, freshly generated address, never ever previously seen before. That's because WikiLeaks wants to make sure that each donation they receive goes to a new public that they create just for that purpose. WikiLeaks is taking maximum advantage of the ability to create new pseudonyms for their own benefit. Best practice for anonymity is to always receive new transactions at a fresh address to make it in a simpler term. 6.2. How would somebody link? Alice wants to buy a teapot that costs 8 bitcoins. Imagine that her bitcoins are in 3 separate unspent outputs at different addresses whose amount are 3, 5, and 6 bitcoins. Alice doesn't have an address with 8 bitcoins sitting in it, so she must combine two of her outputs and inputs into a single transaction to become the amount that she pays to the store. But this reveals that the transaction gets recorded permanently in the blockchain, so it will be there forever. And anyone who sees it can infer that the two inputs to the transaction are most likely under the control of the same user. There can be exceptions. Alice and Bob are roommates and agree to jointly purchase the teapot by each applying one transaction input. So they both give one transaction input to make the output. 6.3 Changing address. This is a difference. The address 8.5 and 0.5. In the other image, it was different. To pay for the teapot, Alice must create a transaction with one output that goes to the merchant and another output that sends charge. To pay for the teapot, Alice must create a transaction with one output that sends change. Sorry, let me restart again. To pay for the teapot, Alice must create a transaction with one output that goes to the merchant, another output that sends change back to herself. But the effectiveness of this type of heuristic depends entirely on the implementation details of commonly used wallet software. There's nothing at all preventing wallets from combining transactions, even when not necessary. Idioms of use. Implementation details of this sort are called idioms of use. In 2013, a group of researchers found an idiom of use that was true of most wallet software and led to a powerful heuristic for identifying change addresses. Specifically, they found that wallets typically generate a fresh address whenever a change is required. Because of this idiom of use, change addresses are generally addresses that have never appeared in the blockchain. Non-change outputs. On the other hand, they're not often not new addresses and may have appeared previously in the blockchain. An adversary can use this knowledge to distinguish change addresses and link them with the input addresses. 6.4 Clustering of addresses. In 2013, paper A Fistful of Bitcoins characterized them. Payments among men and with no names, researchers combine the shared spending heuristic and the fresh change addresses heuristic to cluster Bitcoin addresses. The sizes of these circles represent the quantity of money flying into those clusters, and each edge representing a transaction. Speaking about this part of the image of all the clusters of addresses over here. Clustered Bitcoin addresses uses basic idioms of use as heuristics. When the graph is not labeled, we haven't yet attached identities to the clusters. We might be able to make some educated guess based on what we know about the Bitcoin economy. Back in 2013, Mt. Gox was the largest Bitcoin exchange. So we might guess that the big purple circle represents addresses controlled by them. Talking about this large purple circle right in the middle, which might be Mt. Gox in 2013. We might also notice that the Browns cluster on the left has a tiny volume in Bitcoin, despite having a large number of transactions. This small brown cluster over here, despite having the most transactions. This fits the pattern of the gambling service Satoshi Dice, which is a popular game in which you send a tiny amount of Bitcoins as a wager. Labeled clusters. By transacting with various Bitcoin services providers, Meiklejohn et al. Were able to attach real-world identities to their clusters. Identifying individuals. Can we do the same thing for individuals? That is, can we connect little clusters corresponding to individuals to their real-life identities? To be an answer in this is the answer for this question. Directly transacting. Anyone who transacts with an individual, an online or offline merchant, an exchange, or a friend who splits a dinner bill using Bitcoin knows at least one address belonging to them by a service provider. In the course of using Bitcoin over a few months or years, most users will end up interacting with an exchange or another centralized service provider. These service typically providers these service typically provide ask users for their identities. Often they're legally required to, as we'll see in the next chapter. If law enforcement wants to identify a user, they can turn to these service providers. Irresponsibility, people often post their Bitcoin addresses in public forums. A common reason is to request donations. This is kind of silly and irresponsible. When someone does this, it creates a link between their identity and one of their addresses. If they don't use the anonymity services that will look at in the following sections, they risk having all their transactions de-anonymized. Network layer de-anonymization. There's a completely different way in which users can get de-anonymized that does not rely on transaction graph. Recall that to post a transaction to the blockchain, one typically broadcasts it to Bitcoin's peer-to-peer network. This is the image and the topology of the peer-to-peer network, where messages are sent around that don't necessarily get permanently recorded in the blockchain. In networking terminology, the blockchain is called the application layer, and the peer-to-peer network is the network layer. Network layer de-anonymization was first pointed out by Dan Kaminsky at the 2011 Black Hat conference. He noticed that when a node creates a transaction, it connects to many nodes at once and broadcasts transaction. For example, let's say if we look at this node right here, it's broadcasting all these transactions to all these other nodes and devices. If sufficiently many nodes on the network collide with each other or are run by the same adversary, they can figure out the first node to broadcast any transaction. So they can figure out that this is the first node in the peer-to-peer network. Presumably, that would be a node that's run by the user who created the transaction. The adversary could then link the transaction to the node's IP address. An IP address is close to a real-world identity. There are many ways to try and mask the person behind an IP address. This is why the network layer de-anonymization is a serious problem for privacy. Now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Imran Akbar to finish the second part of the presentation.
Right, my name is Imran Akbar, and I'll be completing off the chapter 6, lecture 6. So we'll be start by 6.3 mixing, and yeah, we can go to the next slide. So one such technique is mixing, and the intuition behind it is very simple. If you want anonymity, use an intermediary. This principle is not specific to Bitcoin and is useful in many situations where anonymity is a goal. As you can see below, there's a figure of mixing. This shows, so basically the user sends coin to intermediary and get back coins that were deposited by other users. This makes it harder to trace a user's coin on the blockchain, which this is basically known as mixing. We're going to go to the next slide now. So firstly, I'll be talking about is online wallets. Online wallets are services where you can store your Bitcoins online and withdraw them at some later date. That's the brief definition of it. And it has several important limits to use online for when using online wallets for mixing. So first, most online wallets don't promise to mix users' funds. Instead, they do it because it simplifies their engineering. You have no guarantee that they won't change their behavior. Second, if they do mix funds, they will almost certainly maintain records internally that will allow them to link your deposit to your withdrawal. Third, in addition to keeping logs internally, reputable and regulated services will also require and record your identity. There are centralized intermediaries that know a lot about our transactions, but from the point of view of a stranger with no privileged information, we have a reasonable degree of privacy. As discussed before, the public nature of the blockchain means that if something does go wrong, for example, let's say a wallet or exchange service gets hacked and records are exposed, the privacy risk is worse than with the traditional system. Moving on to the last point, it's about dedicated mixing services. So compared to online wallets, dedicated mixes promises not to keep records, nor do they require your identity. So what it basically does is they send your Bitcoins to an address provided by the mix, and you told the mix a destination address to send Bitcoins to it. It essentially a swap. Since mixers aren't a place where you store your Bitcoin, unlike wallets, you will want your coins back relatively quickly, which means that the pool of other coins that your deposit will be mixed with is much smaller. Those that were deposited at roughly the same time. Moving on to the next slide. Here we talk about is the use of serial mixes. So the first principle is to use a serial mixes one after the other instead of just a single mix. This is a well-known and well-established principle. For example, Tor, as my colleague discussed before, which we will see in a bit as well, uses a series of 3 routers for anonymous communication. This reduces your reliance on the trustworthiness of any single mix. If any one of the mixes in the series keeps its promise and deletes its records, you have reason to expect that no one will be able to link your first input to the ultimate output that you receive. Here you can see below there's a figure showing the series of mixes. We begin with a user who has a coin or input addresses that we assume that adversary has managed to link to them. The user sends the coin through the various mixes, each time providing a freshly generated output address to the mix. Provided that at least one of these mixes destroy its records of the input to output address mapping, and there are no side channel leaks of information, an adversary won't be able to link the user's original coin to their final one, due to the reason that there's another mix in between. Moving on to the next slide. These are the series of mixes, and we'll start with uniform transactions. We want mixed transactions to be uniform in value so that linkability is minimized. Let me just go a bit detail in that. What it actually means is all mixtures should agree on a standard chunk size, a fixed value that incoming mixed transaction must have. This would increase the anonymity set as all transactions going through any mix would look the same and would not be distinguishable based on their value. Next point, client should be automated. In addition to trying to link coins based on transaction values, a clever adversary can attempt various other ways to de-anonymize, for example, by observing the timing of transactions. These attacks can be avoided, but the precautions necessary are too complex and cumbersome for human users. Instead, the client-side functionality for interacting with mixes should be automated and built into privacy-friendly wallet software. Now we'll move to the next point. Fees should be all or nothing. One way for a mix to charge fees is to take a cut of each transaction that users send in. To avoid this problem, mixing fees should be all or nothing and applied probabilistically. But this is problematic for anonymity because mixed transactions can no longer be in standard chunk sizes. For example, if users try to split and merge their slightly smaller chunks back to the original chunk size, it introduces serious and hard to analyze anonymity risks because of the new linkage between coins that are introduced. In other words, the mix should swallow the whole chunk with a small probability of return in its entirety. Last but not least is mixing in public. There are many mixed services out there, but they have low volumes and therefore small anonymity sets. Worse, many mixes have been reported to steal Bitcoins. Given the dodgy reputation of mixes, not many people would like to use this because it results into low transaction volumes and hence pure anonymity. Each mix operates independently and typically provides a web interface with which the user interacts manually to specify the receiving address and any other necessary parameters. The users get to choose the amount that they would like to mix. The mix will take a cut of every transaction as a mixing fee and send the rest to the destination address. Yeah, moving to the next slide. Yeah, here we'll be talking about lecture 6.5, decentralized mixing. On to the next one. Right, so decentralized mixing is the idea of getting rid of mixing services and replacing them with a peer-to-peer protocol by which a group of users can mix their coins. That's the closest definition to what decentralized mixing is. It also has very more practical advantages, and I'll list some of the advantages. First of all, it doesn't have the bootstrapping problem. Users don't have to wait for reputable centralized mixes to come into existence. Secondly, theft is impossible in decentralized mixing. The protocol ensures that when you put in bitcoins to be mixed, you will get bitcoins back of equal value. Because of this, even though some central coordination turns out to be helpful in decentralized mixing, it's easier for someone to set up such a service because they don't have to convince users that they're trustworthy. Moving on to the next slide. Here we talk about CoinJoin. The main proposal for decentralized mixing is called CoinJoin. So in this protocol, different users jointly create a single Bitcoin transaction that combines all of their inputs. The key technical principle that enables CoinJoin to work is this. When a transaction has multiple input comments from different addresses, the signatures corresponding to each input are separate from and independent of each other. So these different addresses could be controlled by different people. You don't need one party to collect all of the private keys. As you can see on the right side, there's a CoinJoin transaction. This allows a group of users to mix their coins with a single transaction. Each user supplies an input and output address, and together they form a transaction with these addresses. The order of the input and output address is randomized as an outsider will be unable to determine the mapping between inputs and outputs. Participants check that the output address is included in the transaction and that it receives the same amount of Bitcoin that they are inputting, minus any transaction fees. Here you can see CoinJoin can be broken into 5 steps. I will not go into all of the steps into detail, but I will be doing some. So the first one is find peers who wants to mix. Second one is exchange input output addresses. Third is construct transaction. Fourth, send the transaction around. Each peer signs after verifying their output is present. Fifth, broadcast the transaction. We'll start off by finding peers. A group of peers who will want to mix need to find each other. This can be facilitated by servers such as watering holes, allowing users to connect and group in together. Unlike centralized mixes, these servers are not in a position to steal users' funds or compromise anonymity. Second one is exchanging addresses. Once a peer group has formed, the peers must exchange their input and output addresses with each other. It's important for participants to exchange these addresses in such a way that even the other members of the peer group do not know the mapping between input and output address. Otherwise, even if you execute a CoinJoin transaction with a supposedly random set of peers, an adversary might be able to weasel their way into the group and know the mapping of inputs to outputs. To swap addresses is an unlinkable way, so we need an anonymous communication protocol. We could use the Tor network, which we looked at earlier, or a special purpose anonymous routing protocol called a decryption mixnet. Third, go to the slide back. Yeah, so collecting signatures and denial of service. Once the inputs and outputs have been communicated one of these users, it doesn't matter who will then construct the transaction corresponding to these inputs and outputs. The unsigned transaction will then be passed around. Each pair will verify that its input and output addresses are included correctly and signed. Yep, next slide. Right, as you can see on the right side, it's about merge avoidance, and the figure is basically what it's trying to show us is that Alice wishes to buy a teapot for 8 bitcoins. The store gives her 2 addresses and she pays 5 to one and 3 to the other, matching her available input funds. This prevents revealing that these 2 addresses are both belong to Alice. So one technique that can help regain unlinkability in the presence of high-level flow is called merge avoidance, proposed by Bitcoin developer Mike Hearn. To make a payment, a user creates a single transaction that combines as many coins as necessary in order to pay the entire amount to a single address. The merge avoidance protocol enables this by allowing the receiver of a payment to provide multiple output addresses, as many as necessary. The sender and receiver agree upon a set of denominations to break up the payment into and carry out using multiple transactions, as you can see in the figure. Yep, next page. Next page. Yeah, so this is lecture 6.5 about zero coin and zero cash, and I'll be showing to the next slide. Right. So no cryptocurrency anonymity solution has caused as much excitement as zero coin and its successor zero cash. That's both because of the ingenious cryptography that they employ and because of the powerful anonymity that they promise. So let me just go brief detail about zero coin and zero cash. The key feature that provides anonymity is that you can convert base coins into zero coins and back again. And when you do that, it breaks the link between the original base coin and the new base coin. In this system, base coin is the currency that you transact in, and zero coin just provides a mechanism to trade your base coins in for new ones that are unlinkable to the old ones. Cryptographic guarantees. Zero coin and zero cash incorporative protocol level mixing and the anonymity properties come with cryptographic guarantees. To explain zero coin, we'll first introduce the concept of a base coin. Base coin is a Bitcoin like old coin, and zero coin is an extension of this old coin. The key feature that provides anonymity is that you can convert base coins into zero coins and back again, and when you do that, it breaks the link between the original base coin and the new base coin. In the next slide, I will be talking about is minting zero coins. So next slide. Minting zero coins comes into existence by minting, and anybody can mint a zero coin. They come in standard denominations. While anyone can mint a zero coin, as stated before, just minting one doesn't automatically give it any value. You can't get free money. It acquires value only when you put it into the blockchain, and doing that will require giving up on one base coin. To mint a zero coin, you use a cryptographic commitment. So minting a zero coin can be done in 3 steps. First is generate serial number S and a random secret R. Second, compute commit SR, the commitment to the serial number. Thirdly, publish the commitment onto the blockchain, which is shown in figure 6.0, which will be to the next slide. This burns the base coin and making it unspendable and creates a zero coin. Keep S and R secret for now. The figure below is committed to a serial number. So we've talked about it in the previous slide about cryptographic commitment. We can move on to the next slide. We'll start off with, you can see the 2 figures. We'll start off by the figure 6.12. This is where it's putting a zero coin on the blockchain. To put a zero coin onto the blockchain, you create a special mint transaction whose output address is the cryptographic commitment of the zero coin serial number. The input of the mint transaction is a base coin, which now has been spent in creating the zero coin. The transaction does not reveal the serial number. Now onto the last figure. This figure shows spending a zero coin. The spend transaction reveals the serial number committed by the earlier mint transaction, along with a zero knowledge proof that S corresponds to some earlier mint transaction. Unlike a mint transaction or a normal Bitcoin-based transaction, the spend transaction has no inputs and hence no signature. Instead, the zero knowledge proof serves to establish its validity. Once you spend a zero coin, the serial number becomes public and you will now be able to redeem the serial number again. And since there is only one serial number for each zero coin, it means that each zero coin can only be spent once, exactly as we required for security. Moving on to the next slide. We start off by zero cash. It's a different anonymous cryptocurrency that builds onto the concept of zero coin, but takes the cryptography to the next level. It uses a cryptographic technique called zero knowledge snarks, SNARKS. which are a way of making zero knowledge proofs that much more compact and efficient to verify. The upshot is that the efficiency of the system overall gets to a point where it becomes possible to run the whole network without needing a base coin. All transactions can be done in a zero knowledge manner. Moving on to the second point, setting up a zero cash, just like zero coin, cash requires public perimeters to set up the zero knowledge proof system, meaning it uses a cryptographic, once again, to generate these public perimeters, zero cash requires random and secret inputs. And if anyone knows these secret inputs, it compromises the security of the system by enabling undetectable double spends. So now that we have put everything together throughout the presentation, these are the solutions in the table below that we have seen, both in terms of the anonymity properties that they provide and in terms of how deployable they are in practice. So this shows a comparison of the anonymity technology presented in this chapter. And yeah, this is the last slide. And thank you for listening to our presentation by me, Imran Akbar, and my colleague, Mustafa.